Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a really significant and honestly quite sensitive event, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. back on April 4th, 1968.
hmm And the sources you've gathered focus specifically on the persisting conspiracy theories surrounding that day.
Exactly. It's a complex topic, lots of layers.
It really is. And I think it's crucial as we go through this that we just focus on understanding the claims,
Mhm.
looking at the evidence presented in these sources, without trying to land on one side or the other.
Absolutely. The goal here isn't to solve anything, is it? It's more about unpacking all these different threads, the suspicions, the investigations.
Just laying out the different perspectives based on what the sources say. Our main source here being the Wikipedia entry that covers these assassination conspiracy theories.
Right. So let's start at the beginning, or rather the immediate aftermath. King was shot on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis.
Yeah, tragically, just the day after delivering that incredibly powerful "I've been to the mountaintop" speech. Such a stark contrast.
It really is. And his last words, asking Ben Branch to play Take My Hand, Precious Lord, it's just heartbreaking.
It personalizes the tragedy, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Amidst all the politics and history.
Definitely. Now, almost right away, there were unusual details, like Solomon Jones, King's volunteer driver.
Oh, yeah. He reported seeing someone, didn't he? In the bushes across the street.
Yeah, someone kind of hunched over, maybe with a hood up, in that thicket area across Mulberry Street.
And then, almost immediately, those bushes were cleared out.
The very next day, Memphis Public Works employees came and removed them.
Which, if you're looking for reasons to be suspicious, that seems like a big one. Critics immediately pointed to that.
Saying, hang on, that could have been crucial evidence. Or maybe even where another person was hiding.
Exactly. Clearing it so fast, it just looked, well, suspicious to many. Deliberate, perhaps.
Okay, and then we have the man who was convicted, James Earl Ray.
Right. His background. Pretty rough. Poverty, petty crimes, and escaped convict, actually.
And he had the story about a mysterious handler, didn't he? Someone named Roe.
Yeah, a blonde Cuban he called Roe. Ray claimed Raul directed him, told him to buy that specific rifle, the .30 or 6.
The one the FBI said was the murder weapon?
And told him to get a room at that boarding house, the one right across from the Lorraine Motel.
The official story hinges on fingerprints found on that rifle, which Ray apparently dropped or abandoned nearby.
That's how they identified him. But even that, it's been questioned. Martin Luther King III himself later voiced doubts about whether that specific gun was the weapon.
Yeah, the idea of a high-profile assassin just leaving the weapon behind like that,
Right.
it strikes some people as odd. A bit too convenient, maybe.
It does seem improbable to some, yes.
So after the shooting, Ray manages to get out of the country, gets a Canadian passport,
Flees to London, yeah. But they catch him there eventually.
and initially he pleads guilty.
He does. But crucially, that plea deal meant he avoided the death penalty. He got 99 years instead.
But then almost immediately.
He takes it back. Within days, he recants the whole confession. Says he was forced into it, coerced by his lawyer at the time, Percy Foreman, and the threat of the electric chair.
And he maintained that innocence for the rest of his life, right?
Right up until he died in prison in 1998. And that detail about his ashes, wanting them scattered outside the U.S., in Ireland specifically.
Because of how he felt the U.S. government treated him.
It speaks volumes about his perspective, doesn't it? His feeling of being wronged by the system.
So you have Ray recanting almost instantly, plus this backdrop of known government surveillance.
Oh, absolutely. The FBI, maybe the CIA too, were watching King very closely for years. That wasn't a secret.
That combination really laid the groundwork for suspicion, didn't it? For these conspiracy theories to take root.
It definitely did. You have to remember the context. The FBI wasn't just watching King, they were actively hostile. J. Edgar Hoover's animosity was well known.
The attempts to discredit him, the most notorious liar comment.
And worse, there were documented efforts to undermine his leadership, smear his reputation, even that horrifying alleged attempt to push him towards suicide with that anonymous letter and tape.
Right, the so-called suicide package is just chillin'.
It is. So given that history, it's maybe not surprising that people were skeptical of the official story of his death, especially when the supposed killer immediately says, "It wasn't me."
It fosters a deep distrust, which brings us to some of the key figures who really push these alternative theories. William F. Pepper is a big one.
A very big one. He wasn't just a lawyer, he was a friend of Dr. King's. And he spent decades fighting for Ray's release, convinced of his innocence.
He even put on that mock trial for HBO, didn't he, where a jury found Ray not guilty.
He did. And his own theory, laid out in his book Orders to Kill, is quite specific. He points fingers at a U.S. Army Special Forces unit.
The 20th Special Forces Group, he claims, and names an alleged member of the hit team, Billy Eidson, with a police sharpshooter as backup.
Yes. Pepper's connection to King obviously drove him. But, that personal connection is also something historians weigh when looking at his claims. Is it passion or objective analysis? Or both?
And Eidson, the man Pepper named, he denied it very publicly.
He did. Went on camera, said it wasn't true, and even sued Pepper. They settled that suit later. So a direct contradiction there.
Then there's Mark Lane, another prominent voice questioning the official narrative. He was already known for his work on JFK conspiracy theories.
Right. Lane actually represented Ray for a while.
Yeah.
And he wrote Murder in Memphis, originally called Codename Zorro, apparently arguing it was a government plot, a cover-up.
He also did an audio docudrama pushing the same theme.
And interestingly, the House Select Committee on Assassinations later acknowledged that Lane was the source for many of the specific conspiracy claims they investigated.
Okay, let's talk about the physical evidence for a second. The gun, the bullet. You mentioned doubts about the weapon itself, but what about the ballistics?
Well, that's another area that's murky. The initial FBI tests couldn't definitively match the fatal bullet to the rifle Ray supposedly used. They were inconclusive.
Inconclusive. Not exactly a smoking gun, then.
Not really. And then much later, in 1997, more tests were done as part of Ray's appeals.
And what did they find?
According to an affidavit from Ray's legal team back then, those tests also reportedly failed to find unique microscopic markings on the bullet, the kind of fingerprint a gun barrel leaves that could conclusively link it back to Ray's rifle.
So even decades later, the direct link between that bullet and that rifle was still being questioned.
That's what Ray's team argued, yeah. That lack of a definitive match is a cornerstone for many conspiracy arguments. It raises the question, if you can't even be sure about the weapon, what else is uncertain?
Okay, shifting gears slightly, but staying with government agencies, the FBI harassment of King. We touched on it, but it deserves a closer look because it fuels so much of the distrust.
Absolutely. Hoover's obsession, calling King the most notorious liar in the country. It set the tone.
And the surveillance wasn't just passive listening, was it?
Not at all. It started way back with the Montgomery bus boycott in '56. By '63, they had wiretaps on his home and office phones, authorized by Attorney General Robert Kennedy, ironically.
And King knew, or at least suspected, right? He criticized the FBI publicly.
Oh, yeah. He called them out for not doing enough to protect civil rights workers in the South, and internally, within the FBI. A top official, William Sullivan, later testified to the Senate that they waged a kind of war against King using no-holds-barred tactics.
It's hard to hear that phrase, no holds barred, against a figure like King and not wonder how far they might have gone.
Precisely. The context is just damning. It makes it hard for many to accept the FBI's official conclusions about his death at face value.
And this war involved trying to paint him as a communist.
Definitely. They pushed that narrative hard, feeding allegations to RFK, circulating internal memos calling him a genuine Marxist-Leninist, right up until weeks before he was killed.
And the campaign to discredit his personal life.
Just relentless. Smear campaigns, derogatory memos, rumors about affairs, mailing those alleged sex tapes.
And that letter, the anonymous letter sent just before he won the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah, initially everyone thought it was trying to incite him to suicide. King, there is only one thing left for you to do, it said.
But the unredacted version that came out years later suggested something else.
It seemed more aimed at damaging his reputation and maybe pushing him aside in favor of other civil rights leaders the establishment found less troublesome, like Roy Wilkins. Still deeply sinister, just maybe a slightly different flavor of sinister.
Okay, so there's the FBI. But what about the local authorities? The Memphis Police Department. Their actions around the time have also drawn scrutiny.
They have. The city leadership in Memphis was openly hostile to King's planned march supporting striking sanitation workers.
And when he returned to Memphis on April 3rd, the MPD put him under surveillance.
Right. But then, very shortly before the assassination on the 4th, his police security detail at the Lorraine Motel was suddenly withdrawn.
Just pulled. Why?
Well, that's the question. An inspector later said the recall wasn't planned, it just happened. But the police chief, he claimed he didn't even remember King having police protection there.
That sounds conflicting, at best.
It raises eyebrows, certainly. And there's more. 2 black detectives who were watching King's motel from a fire station nearby.
A fire station with a good view, apparently.
An excellent vantage point, the FBI later called it. Those 2 detectives were pulled from their post on the day of the assassination.
Why them?
The official reason given was alleged threats against them, but apparently those threats just vanished after King was killed. And two black firefighters who worked at that same station, they were given the day off.
Huh. So key black personnel with eyes on the motel were removed or absent right around the time of the shooting.
That's the pattern people point to. It feels too coincidental for some. Add to that, the MPD had infiltrated a local black militant group called the Invaders, who sometimes provided security for King.
Okay.
And the FBI, in turn, had informants inside the Memphis Police Department itself.
Wow. So layers upon layers of surveillance, infiltration, and conveniently removed personnel.
It paints a picture of potential chaos, crossed wires, or something more organized, depending on your perspective. It definitely begs the question of whether it was just incompetence or something intentional.
Let's turn to King's own family and his inner circle. What did they believe happened?
Overwhelmingly, they did not believe the official story. The King family has been very consistent over the decades. They believe there was a conspiracy, and they believe James Earl Ray was not the man who killed Martin Luther King Jr.
His son Dexter actually met with Ray in prison, didn't he?
He did, and told him point blank, "My family and I believe you are innocent." Coretta Scott King, his widow, and his daughter Bernice have also publicly stated their belief in a wider conspiracy.
Involving who?
They've suggested government agencies, potentially the mafia, essentially, forces far bigger than just one lone gunman. They saw Ray as a scapegoat.
And this wasn't just the immediate family, right? His associates, too.
Many of them, yes. People who are right there with him, leaders in the movement like John Lewis, Andrew Young, James Lawson, they've all expressed doubts about Ray acting alone or even being the shooter.
James Lawson, who organized the Memphis sanitation strike King, was there to support. He visited Ray in prison, too.
He did, and he came away completely convinced Ray didn't pull the trigger and wasn't the mastermind. Coming from someone so close to King and the events, that carries weight for many people.
So with all these doubts, especially from the family and close allies, what did the later government investigations find? There was the House Select Committee on Assassinations, the HSCA.
Right, formed in 1976 to look into both the JFK and MLK assassinations. They released their report in 1979.
And their conclusion on King?
It concluded there was a likelihood of conspiracy. They thought Ray did fire the shot, but likely as part of the conspiracy, possibly motivated by money offered by white supremacist groups in the St. Louis area. They suggested Ray might have been a scapegoat in a larger plot.
A likelihood of conspiracy. But did they name names or agencies?
No. Crucially, the HSCA stated they found no evidence proving direct involvement by any federal agency like the FBI or CIA or any state or local police department.
But their own chief counsel, Robert Blakey, added a significant caveat, didn't he?
He did. Blakey essentially said, look, if there had been incriminating documents showing agency involvement, they probably would have been destroyed long before our committee ever got started. A very telling admission, really.
It suggests the limits of what even an official investigation could uncover years later. Okay, then there was the Memphis civil trial. That came much later.
Yes, in 1999. This stemmed from claims made years earlier in 1993 by a man named Lloyd Jowers.
Who was Jowers?
He owned a coffee shop and bar called Jim's Grill, which was located on the ground floor of the same rooming house where Ray stayed. Crucially, his place had access to those bushes behind the building, the ones that were quickly cleared.
And what did Jowers claim in '93?
He claimed, very publicly on TV, that he was paid $100,000 by a Memphis produce merchant with alleged mafia ties, Frank Liberto, to help organize King's assassination and frame James Earl Ray. He claimed the actual shooter wasn't Ray.
Wow. Okay, so that claim led to the civil suit.
Exactly. Coretta Scott King and the rest of the family brought a wrongful death lawsuit against Lloyd Jowers and other unknown conspirators. William Pepper, Ray's longtime advocate, represented the King family.
And the outcome of that trial?
The jury, after hearing weeks of testimony, returned a unanimous verdict. They found that Jowers was part of a conspiracy to kill Dr. King.
And did they implicate others?
Yes, significantly. The jury specifically found that governmental agencies, including the Memphis Police Department, state agencies, and federal agencies, were also part of this conspiracy.
That's huge. How did the King family react?
They saw it as total vindication. They felt the trial had finally uncovered the truth they'd believed all along, that it was a wide-ranging conspiracy involving government actors, and Ray was framed.
But that verdict wasn't the final word, was it? The Department of Justice reviewed it.
Right. In 2000, Attorney General Janet Reno announced the results of a DOJ reinvestigation prompted by the Jowers trial, and their conclusion was quite different.
What did they find?
They found no credible evidence of a conspiracy. They essentially dismissed Jauer's claims, pointing to major inconsistencies in his various accounts over the years, and said there wasn't reliable corroborating evidence for his story or the jury's findings.
So, a direct contradiction to the civil jury's verdict.
Pretty much. And critics of the civil trial, like author Gerald Posner, who wrote a book arguing Ray was the lone killer, and even Robert Blakey from the HSCA, they criticized the trial, suggesting it was one-sided and didn't rigorously test the evidence presented.
So we're left with these completely opposing conclusions from a civil jury and a federal investigation.
Exactly. Which really sums up the whole situation, doesn't it? Deeply conflicting narratives, unresolved questions.
So wrapping up this deep dive, it's clear just how complex and contested the story of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination remains, even all these decades later.
Absolutely. We've got the official account, James O. Ray, the lone assassin, pleading guilty, then recanting. Then you have these persistent, detailed conspiracy theories involving handlers, government plots, framed scapegoats.
And investigations reaching wildly different conclusions, the HSCA seeing a likelihood of conspiracy, the Memphis jury finding government agencies responsible, the DOJ finding no credible evidence of it.
Yeah, the sources really paint a landscape just filled with suspicion, deep-seated doubt, and questions that, for many, have never been satisfactorily answered. The shadow of that government surveillance, the FBI's documented hostility, it hangs over everything.
It really does. Which leads us to a final thought for you, the listener. When you consider this historical context, the surveillance, the distrust, the conflicting findings, what does exploring this event tell us about how we grapple with major historical moments, especially ones tangled up in social upheaval and political power?
And thinking about all these different threads, the ballistics questions, the removed police details, the family's conviction, Jauer's claims, what further lines of inquiry seem most compelling to you now? What questions still linger?